Hello guys, welcome to the Inspiration and Enlightenment Slow Talk. This is a part of a series in which I compare and synchronize enlightenment and psychology. This is the first video in a short series about the ego, our temporary identification that we assume during incarnations. So we are an ego and we do ego all day. So we should really know what an ego is or who we are. But if we have a closer look, the ego quickly becomes a mystery. Allow me to demonstrate that. Who are you? Did you just think of your name? That's just a label. Who are you really? Did you just think of your nationality or the place where you live? That's not really you, is it? So who are you really? Did you just think of your parents or family? The environment in which you live? That's just a place where you live. These are relationships you have, and whatever your parents gave you is only a part of you. So who are you really? Did you just think about your job or your hobby or your heart's desire that you're pursuing? These are things you do. So who are you really? Did you just think about your title, doctor, professor, or the things you achieved in life? These are just things you did. That's not really you. So who are you really? Did you try to go deeper? Think about your thoughts, your feelings, your wishes, your dreams, your desires. That's not you either. You have thoughts, you have dreams, you have desires, and they change all the time. The thoughts and dreams and wishes you had as a child are very different from the thoughts and dreams and wishes you have now. So who are you really? So as you can see, it's very difficult to actually know who we are. We know a lot about ourselves, all these things we know about ourselves, but we don't know who we really are. So all the things we know about ourselves, that's like a cloud that surrounds who we really are. Like our job, our titles, the things we do, the things we think and feel and wish. This is a cloud, and this cloud changes all the time. And it's intangible. There's nothing solid in it. So somewhere deep in that cloud is that which we really are. Now what is that? Buddhism has some interesting things to say about the ego. It's a little negative, it's a bit of a negative view, which I don't think is adequate, and I will try to correct that a little in this series. So who's better than Eckhart Tolle to explain the Buddhist view on the ego? And I will put a link in the comments of an interview of Eckhart Tolle by Russell Brand. It's basically Eckhart Tolle in a nutshell. I recommend it very much to watch this. So Eckhart Tolle defines the ego as the one doing the thinking. That goes back to a French philosopher called Descartes, who came up with the famous slogan, "I think, hence I am." I don't think that's a complete view, because before we think, we actually feel. So we could expand this a little bit, saying the ego is the one being conscious of thoughts, of feelings, as well as of experiences, what's going on in the external world. So the ego is not only engaged in being conscious of experiences and thoughts and feelings and all what's going on inside the external and internal world, it's also busy all the time to maintain its status as an identification. And naturally, the ego identifies itself with possessions, mostly of in the external world. For example, its body, and if the body is handsome or pretty, the appearance of the body. Then also it identifies with his car, with his house, with the relationship it has, yes, its social status that it has, and many other things it owns. And because these possessions or these things are continuously shifting and changing, there is no solidity to this kind of identification. And that's why Buddhism states very clearly the ego is an illusion. It doesn't really exist. And the attachment to these external identifications that the ego produces causes suffering. Because these possessions are elusive, the ego is elusive, and what does this cause? This causes fear. The fear of losing what we own and the fear of losing our identification. And fear brings suffering, and fear causes anger. Anger causes violence, and violence causes more suffering. Since the ego is always on this quest to secure its own identification, it has this need to distinguish itself from other people. And this causes the rat race or the hound race. The rat race and hound race after social standing. In its worst form, the ego even seeks the resistance of other people and adversity, or even enemies, in order to distinguish himself. This is a very important part of what Eckhart Tolle sees, that much animosity in the world comes from the need of the ego to have enemies. So according to the Buddhist view, what is then our true ego, or what is behind our true ego? And Eckhart Tolle says this is the pure, formless awareness. So he recommends to give up the ego and all its possessions and its stupid games, and seek this pure, formless awareness or consciousness. In this particular instant, I do not agree with Eckhart Tolle. I believe that there is a true self or a higher self, and our task is to move our identification from the ego to the higher self or the true self. So what does psychology say about the ego? According to the science of consciousness, the ego is that thing or entity in the brain that watches the central stream in the frontal lobe. The ego is a self-aware piece of consciousness that relates experiences to itself. The ego is, interestingly, the ego is produced by the old part of the brain, the one we share with the animals. Hence it's pretty ancient. It's like millions and millions of years old. I'll put a link in the show notes to a TED talk about the science of consciousness, which explains the current state of consciousness research. And according to Freud, the ego stands or hangs between the id, which is subconsciousness, and the superego, which is education, morality, and parental influence. according to Carl Jung, the ego has a shadow. That's the unconscious part of the ego. So mind again, the shadow is not subconsciousness, it's the part of the ego that resides within subconsciousness. Now the shadow can be an anima or animus. It's a male or female shadow ego. Yeah, so a man has a female shadow ego and a woman has a male shadow ego. I don't completely agree with this, but I will get back to that in later on. So also Jung differentiates the persona, which is basically the social mask of the ego, and determines the way the ego behaves in public. This is beautifully illustrated by the story of Narcissus, who fell in love with an image of himself. Mind he did not fall in love with himself, but rather with the image of himself. And that image of himself is the persona, the mask we wear in public. So while we can be perfectly in love with our own image, our social image, we can actually hate ourselves or what we think we actually truly are. And this ambivalence of loving our social image and hating ourselves, how we are in private, that actually causes narcissism. And then Jung also came up with the notion of the archetypes. But he believed that the archetypes belong to the collective unconscious. Yeah, and again, there are negative and positive appearances of these archetypes. For example, the great mother and the terrible mother, the wise man, or the trickster, and is the hero and the villain, and things like that. So what if these archetypes are not archetypes of the not only the archetypes of the collective unconscious, but what if these archetypes also determine and produce the different ego identities we can take on? And again, I will come back to that. So there's this internal family system model, which is a psychological model, and I will link to this in the show notes. And that stipulates that the mind is made of relatively discrete subpersonalities, I would say sub-identifications, each with its own viewpoint and qualities and thoughts and feelings. They came up with 3 types of sub-identifications or egos: the managers, the exiles, those who were exiled, those which we ignore, and the firefighters who come in case of emergency. And according to the internal family system model, they come up with a therapy. That therapy is called the ego state therapy, and it already identified distinct ego states, for example, the frightened child or the control freak. And after defining the characteristics and functions of these ego states and recognizing them, if the patient is able to recognize them, the therapist can then use various techniques to help the patient to manage this. Yeah, there are behavioral, cognitive, analytic, and humanistic therapies. Yeah, and the goal is to achieve a reintegration, or, which I believe is very interesting, some kind of an internal diplomacy. So you recognize that there are multiple identities within yourself, and you rule them with some kind of a democratic approach. In this new psychology, or this new idea of multiple identities, the ego is quite a fluid thing. In fact, there are not one but many egos. So, okay, there I said it. We actually have multiple egos, and even Eckhart Tolle, he indicates that. He likes to indicate that. He said, for example, let's take for example, if you say, I hate myself, or I love myself. Who is hating whom? And I'm sure, like everybody else, you have this kind of internal dialogue going on where different voices are talking to each other. So don't get scared. It's a fact that we have multiple egos, and it's fairly easy actually to live with these multiple identities if we know what they are and how to deal with them. Now, having multiple personalities or identifications does not mean we have a psychological disorder. Yeah, there are mechanisms in place, natural mechanisms that manage these sub-egos or multiple egos and still create an illusion of ego continuity. Yeah. But when these mechanisms stop working, and our identification shifts randomly and uncontrolled from one identification to another, then we have a disorder. And this disorder is called dissociative identity disorder, DID. Again, having multiple identities is natural. Yeah, we're born with it. Not being able to manage them causes DID. Yeah. And one proof why DID is real is because it can be induced by hypnosis in any person. A person with psychological issues and a person apparently having no psychological issues. Yeah, another proof should be also obvious to many people. Aren't you a completely different person at work and at home? Because at work and at home, there are very, very different requirements you have to meet, and these are two very different roles. So you will find that you are actually two entirely different people when you're at work and at home. Thank you for watching this episode of the Inspiration and Enlightenment Slow Talk. Please help spreading the light with a like and a share, and don't forget to subscribe. Love and light.